Welcome to the University of Michigan Medical School Office of Research, Everything But the Science series, brought to you by the Grant Services and Analysis Office. These excerpts from our R01 Bootcamp workshop are intended to assist faculty new to the NIH R-Series process think through best approaches to the administrative portions of grant submissions.
Hello, everybody. I'm Heather Offhouse from the Grant Services Office, and I have the formidable task of talking about budgets without talking about numbers. So it could be quite interesting, and hopefully we'll have some good conversation about it. Why are we talking about budgets today? As you look through the slide, know that this is part of the financial requirements of your university role is to make sure you understand what is in your budget and you're asking for appropriate costs. You are charged with being a good steward of financial resources. And so it's a very important part, not only for your review, but back at the institution as well. It's important to remember that as you craft your specific aims, what you describe in your specific aims will drive what needs to be in your budget. And in the review process, there will, while not a scored component of your application, there will be discussion at times about your budget and how appropriate it is for the aims. So as you write your aims, know that is driving your budget. And similarly, if you decide there are things you do or don't want to ask for in your budget, reviewers can look back at your aims and see if you can accomplish the work. So they are very symbiotically tied. So when we look at budgets, you are showing you know how to accomplish the project. So you do want to watch how you're proposing your budget over time. It could be that you have 5 equal chunks that you're asking for across that time period. It could also be that you need to consider whether in year 3 you need to purchase a piece of equipment, or maybe in year 5 you need more biostatistics support than you did in the first year. So you can see fluctuations of your costs across the application number of years of the budget. So do keep that in mind and know that that is something that you want to prepare for and consider when you're talking about your aims. So there's a little bit more. The university wants you to know that recovery of the full cost of your project is necessary. If you look down at that kind of third $ bullet, you'll want to keep in mind that in additional, as you propose your budget, if it's not a budget that you can live by once you receive the award, it could impact not just your review, but also when you get into the institution and you need to perform the work. If you don't have adequate resources financially, you may not be able to complete all of the specific aims you had lined out. It could then impact your scientific progress. So there are some tips to budgeting that we want to make sure that you're thinking about, because we are going to want to make sure that you're the best prepared for doing things. Don't just decide I'm going to put in a modular budget, right? If you don't know what modular is, we're going to come back to that a bit later, but we want to advocate and have you talk about internally in your departments about how to spend your costs. And so what we'd like to see you think about is putting together a budget that shows all costs that you would potentially need to complete the specific aims, and then start splitting that into columns of, am I going to be asking the NIH for that, or am I going to be looking for internal resources, say from a startup package, or maybe some departmental funds. So think about first the full cost of that research. If you do cut corners, you'll again could end up short in post-award from having things be available. So when we talk about crafting that, we've written down sort of 5 reasons that you should think about writing all of the details. Broad swipes are good for a start to think about your budget setup, to think about where you want to make sure you've got your costs. But when you put down those extra details, you can see a lot of benefit from that. It'll be easier when you sit down to write your budget justification if you have those details to refer back to. It also creates a long-term financial map. When you rework your application during the submission process, because you will rework your budgets, as you go through that, having those details will allow you to move more quickly through. as you think about what kind of costs you want to recover, you want to make sure that all of the costs you propose are reflected in your specific aims. Every cost, there's a cost accounting standards that the university is required to follow. In that process, we have to show how every expense ties back to the work being proposed and being done. So you do want to make sure that everything is direct benefit to the project. And it could be related to the roles and responsibilities. So back to that idea of having a biostatistician and making sure that there's enough effort, and the word enough is kind of tricky. But when you think about how much time they need to complete their work, that's what reviewers are sort of tuned into and can comment on whether it's appropriate. And so that effort then becomes dollars that you request. When we talk about budgets, NIH budgets and the format in the application package of the 424 Form G form set are kind of the gold standard for categories. So we'll kind of talk through some of those, but hopefully, in addressing all of these things, we'll talk a bit in the discussion about whether the budget will impact peer review. Again, it's important to remember that you're showing you know what to do as an investigator and that you can accomplish the work. So we have a great question too, which comes up, every year about whether there's a minimum amount of effort that a PI should put on the project, especially early stage investigators. I'm going to start with the very technical answer of no, there's not a minimum. You should put down the amount of time it will take you to do the project. We are very focused at the university on what's called effort reporting. Once you receive an award, you have to attest that you spent the time you say you spent on it. So we don't want to see anything out of line for that. But we do know that early stage investigators need that time to spend on their specific aims, to spend on the project. And so you will get advice from mentors and those in your department about whether there's sort of a target. I'm going to call it a target instead of a minimum amount of effort that you may want to think about crafting into your budget and justification. And in doing that, making sure that you're taking on and showing reviewers that you're taking on the required work that supports that amount of time. Reviewers are good and will sniff out if you put down that you're spending 40% of your time on a project, but they can't find the specific aim work or even listing in your justification that supports that. They could comment on that as part of the review. There are significant budget categories. As I mentioned, NIH is sort of the gold standard. Personnel typically make up about 46% of your budget. I know 46 is a very precise number for about. We took a look at the data of how much is spent on investigators, the faculty, their co-investigators, technical staff, the fringe benefits related to them, and almost half of your budget will be spent on those types of costs in most cases. To remember that in addition to thinking about the people and how much time they need to perform the work, as well as talking about effort. And when we talk about effort in proposals, NIH wants us to talk in calendar months. So there are 12 calendar months in a year. No one can spend 13 because they don't exist. But when you talk about percent of time, that'll get converted to a calendar month representation. So 10% effort is 1.2 calendar months. Simple math. And then you'll also include for them fringe benefits. Now, the university has several ways to approach fringe benefits. Your department research administrator would be a very good person to start with to talk about what those look like. But you are required to carry fringe benefits into your project if a portion of salary is supported. And while tuition, we tend to budget tuition in a category called helpfully other. Tuition is a type of fringe benefit we offer to our GS&As. So that will also come into play that if you are using a graduate student research assistant, you need to make sure that you're budgeting for their tuition as well. The remaining budget categories kind of cover all of the goods and supplies for your project. This can range, of course, from equipment to travel. There are some cases where you will have patient care costs. Each of these have a lot of nuances to how they can be budgeted with the NIH. NIH allows certain costs and doesn't allow others. We've created an appendix for you that is a PDF that you can read through many of these topics in more specific information. One thing to pull out in these budget categories is to talk to and think about your core services needed. This could be ULAM animal care. It could be use of the sequencing core. Any of these, they have set fees required in those core areas. So you'll want to make sure you're leaving time in your budgeting process to reach out to them, to talk to them about their cost structures. Your research administrator can help you with this. It doesn't have to be you having that conversation, but these are very good places to have hidden costs where you might think, I want to put $10,000 aside for sequencing. You probably want to visit with them to talk about their actual cost structure to make sure that that amount is adequate. There is also a subject costs, if those of you are doing clinical work, talking about patient incentives for participation or covering some of patient costs related to their participation. This is distinctly different than the NIH definition of participant costs. So we bring it up today only to remind you to be careful about terminology, because we want to talk about subject fees or subject support, and participant costs are specifically defined by the federal government when we bring others into our university to train them. So stay away from the word participant. And I did see a small note pop up about where do publication fees fall. That is in the great other at the bottom. So if you look at the 424 budget form in the Form G set, there is a section where you can add specific items of cost in blank lines in order to add them and put down an amount and then justify in your justification. And we can come back to talking about any of these budget categories in the question time. So once you sit down and do that breakout of all costs, listing down, as I mentioned in an earlier slide, all of the costs that might be related to your specific aims, and then splitting it out to, we're going to ask the NIH for it or not. This is the point when you start to talk about which budget format you use, and not until this point, because otherwise you might, we tend at the University of Michigan for some reason to sort of undersell our research, where we see that our average R01 size across the board to our peers is significantly less than our peers are asking for and receiving. So we don't want you to kind of put that together and under identify costs. But you can choose whether at this point you're going in for what's called a modular budget or a categorical budget. And on this slide, you can see all the definitions. A modular, this is direct cost, average direct cost per year. If you take all of the costs you've put out and set out and identified, if you average those over the time period of your grant, assuming 5 years, say, and it comes out to $250,000 or less, NIH wants you to use the modular format. If that average comes out to $250,000 or more, you should be in what's called a categorical. And where it happens is once you decide modular or categorical, you'll go into different types of formats. So a modular budget has, you ask for things in $25,000 chunks. So you might ask for 200, 225, or 250,000. You don't get any number in between, so you want to round up. Categorical, you'll ask for actual costs down to the dollar, no pennies. And then you'll usually on a modular side have equal amounts per year, unless there's a very specific anomaly, say a large equipment purchase in one of the years that might throw your modules out of order. But a categorical can vary with cost needs. And then we'll talk about the justification in a minute, but there's very limited information that you do for a modular in the directions. You'll talk about people, you'll talk about their effort and what they're doing on the project, and maybe some subcontractors, but beyond that, you don't talk about any of the specific sort of goods and services that you need to purchase. It's just considered part of the total asked for. The categorical, you're going to line out in detail every significant purchase. And the interesting thing, know that modulars were introduced in 1996. This is your history moment. In 1996, they were introduced at 250,000 and they have not changed since. So most research that you are doing, again, depending on your specific aims, will likely should maybe be in that categorical section because the cost of research has gone up very consistently. The modular does require you to make some adjustments. And again, I'm going to mention your research administrator in your unit is very good to help with these things. You cannot use things like infinite salary amounts for perhaps some of your co-investigator or yourselves. If you hit the NIH salary cap, you have to stop budgeting at that point in a modular. GS&As also have a compensation cap and inflationary increases aren't allowed. But if you're doing a categorical, you can ask for actual costs in all these areas. NIH does say in their directions, what they'll do is apply the fiscal policy in place at time of your award. We've heard a lot from chairs that they would like to see more people go in with a categorical budget. So this is, again, a good conversation to have back with your home unit to discuss the pros and cons and what the expectations are from your unit. And so we'll come back. I see that Jonathan asked a quick question about how does asking for a categorical budget impair? So we'll talk about that in the questions too. And I've mentioned a couple of times research administrators, if you don't know who you have yet, you should talk to them, meet them, let them know you're going through this course and that you would like to partner with them on budgeting. They can very much help you with some planning, some good choices to make, give you some advice on things they've seen before, as well as your mentors and your department leads.
Thank you for watching this video. For additional tools and resources, please see our website under the Training and Resources section or by reaching out through email at msgrants@umich.edu.